Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of If Not Us. I'm your host, Eric Facas, and I have the pleasure of speaking with my old friend, Jason Rezaian today. Thank you for joining us, Jason.
Thanks for having me on, Eric. It's a pleasure to reconnect over new issues after a long time.
So today's episode is about press freedom, and Jason has a lot of experience with that. Jason is a reporter, journalist for the Washington Post. He also directly experienced some of the pitfalls and real painful moments of being an international journalist when he was imprisoned in Iran for 544 days. A couple of years ago, and wrote a wonderful book about it. If anyone hasn't seen or read Prisoner by Jason Rezaian, I recommend you pick it up and check it out. I think one of the best reviews that I read about it was something to the extent of how this was obviously an historical moment, a true story, but it read like a spy novel, and that's just the experience that you lived for those almost 2 years. So I couldn't agree more when I read it. It's hard to put down. It's an exciting story. It's also painful to read as someone that knows you personally and went through a lot of those struggles together from the other side of the world. I certainly don't want to relive that moment, but for people that haven't heard of you before, haven't met you or read your book, if you could share a little bit of that background, that would be really helpful.
Yeah. So I had moved to Iran in 2009 after traveling back and forth many times for the previous several years, freelancing. And I decided that, my dream had always been to be a foreign correspondent. And this was my opportunity, right? I had enough experience at that point and a bit of a catalog of work that I could point to. And so, in 2009, I became really the only US citizen based in Iran working as a journalist. And Iran is not the same kind of media landscape as the United States or Europe or something like that. I mean, you go there and you have to register with the ministry that oversees press activities, and you have to have a letter from a news organization in your home country that is sponsoring your accreditation. And I had that, and I worked in that way in full transparency within the red lines of that system for years. In the middle of that, in 2012, I was approached to take over the Washington Post bureau job, which was a golden opportunity for somebody who works in the news business. And I did that for several years, and I loved it. It was a chance to have a say in in the paper of record of the U.S. Capitol. And things were going on perfectly normally by the standards of Iran for my wife and me. She was a journalist for Bloomberg, and then later for The National, which is an English language newspaper based in Abu Dhabi. She's Iranian, born and raised in Tehran, and we lived this kind of great life of a media minor power couple, right? And it was fantastic. Our home was a place that people visiting Tehran would descend on. We would have gatherings and discussions, and it was a great life. And then very suddenly, in the summer of 2019, in the midst of very high level nuclear negotiations between Iran and world powers, including the United States, our home was raided and we were taken prisoner. We didn't understand what was going on at the time. We were accused of being spies, put in solitary confinement, held for a very long time. both of us in solitary. And ultimately, we were, charged with a crime of espionage, with conspiring with the United States to undermine the national security of Iran. Obviously, that wasn't true, but this was a pretense to essentially hold me, a U.S. citizen, hostage against those nuclear negotiations. I was taken specifically as leverage in those negotiations, which was something that didn't become clear to me until much later in my detention, because I was being kept in isolation, subjected, to relentless interrogations for many hours a day for months. And finally, as those negotiations came to a climax and a deal was being brokered, I was, myself and several other Americans being held hostage in Iran, and some Iranians being held in U.S. prisons for violating sanctions laws, were released in a prisoner swap in January of 2016. So that was kind of, one of the defining experiences of my adult life. And although I was willing to work in Iran under the limitations and the framework of a pretty rigid system, I understood very well the importance of press freedom and free expression that we have here in the US and that we have in Europe and Australia and Canada and Japan and a handful of other countries. And it was something that, I don't want to say that I took it for granted at the time, but it wasn't something that I had the visceral experience of that I do now, right? And so when I came out 5 years ago or so, it became really important to me to defend this right and promote this right around the world, but especially here at home.
Yep. Yeah, it's such a crazy story. It's hard to do justice to all that you went through and experienced in Yeganeh as well in a short period of time. But knowing you personally and seeing that journey, it's been, the highs and lows have been extremely low, and have, since gotten much higher. And it's been wonderful to see you thrive in a post Iranian prison life that you're living now. And I love the champion that you've become for press freedom around the world, and have appreciated some of the stories that you've done about people that are being held, and similar to you, sort of as leverage or for other reasons, but really because they are high profile in the press, like you were, a target, or to suppress the voice that you have and the important role that you play in the press and in the world. I'm curious, when you came out, shortly after we started hearing about the term fake news, and while labeling the press as fake news and enemy of the people and the other terms that we heard thrown around in 2015 and 2016, and still here today. I'm curious from your perspective as a journalist, like how that affects you, how you feel about those terms.
So, I've been following this pretty closely for these past few years, and I think that when we hear government officials, whether they're American officials or officials in authoritarian countries like Iran, like Turkey, like the Philippines, Egypt, Poland, these are some of the most egregious users of those terms. What it really means is critical coverage, right? Fake news is an authoritarian's synonym for coverage of me that I don't like.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that is pretty well understood by most thinking, media savvy, educated people, right? And I think a big target and a big goal of these campaigns of labeling things as fake news or labeling journalists as enemy of the people, it's designed to dumb down a society, right? It's putting catchphrases to ideas that are much more complicated than
Yeah.
the two words that they're being used. So for me personally, it hurts me when I see that it's working, right? That it's an uphill battle. I spoke recently, also, around World Press Freedom Day events for this year with Maria Ressa, the founder of Rappler, a news agency in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
And Maria is really on the forefront of this. Most people don't know this, but the Philippines is the country that people spend more time online
Yeah.
than literally anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
Right. So it is kind of a testing ground or a petri dish of the effect of internet and social media on the society. And she and her organization have really tracked the use of these terms. And in a lot of cases, in a lot of these countries, the attacks on journalists, especially on female journalists, are very sexualized, very brutal, dehumanizing, and so it's demoralizing for sure. But at the end of the day, my attitude has been just keep my head down and keep telling the truth, because we live, as much as we live in a moment where there are powers at play trying to pull the wool over our eyes, it's also kind of a very transparent moment. You can't hide things the way that you used to, right? So the authoritarians' play is to try and dupe people, right? Try and make them dumber, because that's the only way to do it. So it's sad, but we have the tools available to us to combat this, but it requires a really connected and concerted effort to do that. And so for me, I don't discriminate in terms of whether I agree with somebody's political points of view about something or not. If someone is an independent journalist bringing important truths about the society they live and work in to the forefront, to the public, no matter where they stand on the political spectrum, I'm for that. And when those people are attacked, wherever they are in the world, if I catch wind of one of these stories, I'm going to tell it. I'm going to tell it out loud. And there is, kind of a growing patchwork of stories that are different but connected. And unfortunately, in the 5 years since my release, the number of journalists who've been imprisoned or murdered for the work that they do continues to rise. And the most famous, well-known case, obviously, is Jamal Khashoggi, who wrote for the same section of the Washington Post as I do. He was somebody that I was just starting to get to know on a personal level. We had a lot in common because we both cared very deeply about a country where we had roots. For me, Iran, where my father was from and where I chose to live. For him, Saudi Arabia, where he was born and raised and played a very prominent role in the politics of that society for decades, but that had ultimately been exiled.
Yeah.
and really harmed. And I was very lucky to escape that monster. He was not. And so this has really added even more fuel to my efforts. And being in the Washington Post building when we learned of Jamal's disappearance, I was the first person to write about it for the Post. I was, given the assignment of writing the first story about Jamal disappearing, learning, details over a period of weeks, and seeing how the Washington Post leadership, from our publisher to the opinions editor, to our legal team, to our PR team, spring into action. and knowing that so much of what they did was informed by their advocacy for me. We talk about things being very meta, right? Some stuff hits really close to home. And for me, that was one of those kind of pivotal moments in my life. And I don't know how long I'll be a journalist, but I do know that I'm always going to be all in on advocating for press freedom and democracy and people's right to express themselves, no matter what their opinions are.
Yeah, it's crazy to imagine that experience being on your side, but thankful that you're sharing that with all your stories and the work that you do. I know you wanted to talk a bit about something that is sort of a more subtle and nuanced version of intimidation, psychological warfare, so to speak, on journalists, and in particular, something that you've been experiencing, as a follow-up to your imprisonment. The TV show in Iran, based loosely off of you, which I know you and I had a good chuckle about when it first came out, but we laughed to keep from crying. It's a more serious violation of press freedom, and I know that that's something that you're writing about as well. Would love to have you go into that story.
Yeah. So 2 years ago, I saw a news report on the Iranian news, a story about a television show that was being produced that was supposedly following the Jason Rezaian spy case. And there was a picture of an actor who, I think, was he bald with glasses and overweight? Yeah. Did he look like me? I don't think so. I think I'm a lot better looking than that guy. But this was like the ultimate act of trolling, right? It was extending the abuse of me from what they did to me to a fictionalized account, supposedly of me, where they tried to make me look guilty of all sorts of crimes and misdemeanors. I was the architect of sanctions against Iran. I was dictating what the Iran's nuclear negotiators were doing in their negotiations with Americans. I was an immoral person smoking cigarettes and drinking and carousing with women. They were fat shaming me. I mean, like all kinds of shit. I don't know if we can say that, but it was a combination of all those things. And it was 30 episodes, the highest budgeted television show in the history of the Islamic Republic.
Wow.
And there was a concerted, coordinated social media campaign with hashtags and everything along with it. And that ended up with, months of my wife and I receiving every manner of death threat that you could imagine. And, that was 2 years ago. They did a second season right recently, aired in April of this year. And in that season, the villain is an MI6 operative, but, I'm supposedly in touch with this person. So, I appear a couple of times in the show, but the second season opens with a scene of an Iranian exiled journalist. This is a true story. Exiled in France, who ran a very successful and highly trafficked news site, was lured to Iraq by Iranian agents, abducted there, taken back to Tehran, and then put on trial and ultimately executed late last year. So, the opening scene is a glorification of that, right? They're in a third country. He's traveling to a meeting, doesn't know who he's going to meet, and there's these members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. They put a hood over his head, put him in the back of a van, take him back to Iran, unhood him, and here he is in Tehran. It's the glorification and justification of extraterritorial abduction and extrajudicial murder.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal, right? Especially when this is being portrayed as factual, right? They're taking credit for this thing that they did. In the series that they made where I'm the antagonist, the first 28 and a half episodes are figments of their imagination. I mean, it's like all of the ridiculous accusations they made against me. But in the last episode and a half, deals with the time in which I'm arrested and being held and then traded for. And in that context, you get to see the world as these people would like it to be, right? And I think that there is a deep responsibility on the United States government, on the United Nations, on the international community, especially at a time when we're negotiating with the leadership of Iran, to push back on this sort of thing. Somebody needs to be held accountable. Now, if they're not going to be held accountable for what they did to me, they need to be held accountable for other cases. In this case, Rezaian was the name of the journalist who was lured back and then executed. In the weeks that the second series was airing, my wife and I started getting all kinds of death threats once again. And often the things that they would say were directed at she and I, at our infant child, right? And in many instances, we're going to do to you what the Saudis did to Khashoggi, So my point in saying that is that all of these things are connected. This is one world. And, tomorrow it'll be Egypt doing a show like this. And next month it'll be the Philippines. And right after that, it'll be Russia. And all of those efforts to undermine the work of the press that are being made online, when they're brought into the sphere of popular culture, especially television and film, and huge budgets are put behind it, it's an indication of how important the work that we do is. It really is this kind of flattery, right? Like, am I a spy that created the sanctions, on Iran? Did I do anything to undermine Iran's national security? Did I, was I sold back to America for $1.7 billion? No, none of that stuff's true. But, the fact that they can attach all of that to a journalist goes to show you how important the work that we do actually is. And for me, you know me as well as anyone, and I like to make light of things, and there is something ridiculously funny about this whole thing. At the same time, it's deadly serious.
I couldn't agree more. I have a picture. We'll let you decide if this looks like you or not.
Like I said, I think they did a great job of getting the color and the glasses, but I'm a much better looking guy than that. And I never wear a trench coat.
I've never seen you wear a trench coat before. I can attest to that. I'm glad your sense of humor is as strong as it is, and your optimism is as great as it is, because these are real serious things, and I know that you do take it seriously. But yeah, I agree. It's a testament to the importance of the work that you and others do. If it's worth it for them to go to such great lengths, to discredit it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's for me, that's the missing headline here. Obviously, I think they thought that I would shut up, and I haven't, and I'm not gonna, and neither are other people, right? So we're going to be fighting this fake news moniker for a long time. The best way to do it, I think, is to just kind of present facts, right? Just keep pushing out the reality. And sometimes, for me, when I tell these stories about other journalists who've been murdered or detained, stories in the media about the media traditionally don't get a lot of attention, right? So I've always just tried to find the human angles of the people who are being persecuted. A couple of years ago in Myanmar, the regime there detained 2 Reuters journalists because they uncovered genocide against the Rohingya Muslims. And I just It was a massive story, but one that couldn't get as much traction as it should. And, I did everything I could to just like talk about who these guys are. Two young guys, one a recent dad, thrown in prison because he's telling the truth. I mean, that kind of persecution, that kind of injustice is not new. And to me, it's kind of like a badge of honor to be a point on this long continuum of people who have been subjected to injustice by massive power, much greater than themselves. And some of us have fortunately survived to tell about it, and some of us haven't. But it's like it's part of the human condition, right? And as long as it exists, we're going to have work to do.
I love the fact that your response is to continue to tell the truth, continue to expose injustice and the work that you do. But I'm gonna share some perspective from what I see and leave you with that. I love the phrase that you used earlier describing fake news, the calling it a catchphrase, a good catchphrase. And to me, as a marketer, a lifelong marketer, I see things and it doesn't surprise me when they stick.
Right.
Branding matters so much, and getting a quick catchphrase etched into someone's brain makes it more repeatable and makes it more shareable. I don't like to give Donald Trump credit for much, but the branding that he did, the nicknames that he gave people, the catchphrases like fake news, is what had them take off. It helped them take off, right? So if journalism's role is to continue to expose the truth, continue to share what's happening, there needs to be some branding in it. There needs to be catchphrases to combat the work that is being done to discredit you. And I'm not saying that you fight fire with fire. We don't need to create a TV show about somebody else to expose them in the same way. But yeah, it's that catchiness, it's that little branding that I think is missing. The truth is wonderful, but sometimes it's a long story. We live in a society where people read headlines, not articles.
Yeah.
It needs to, the catchphrases matter. I don't know how to act on this, but just an observation. If we had people thinking about the catchphrases that will protect press freedom and uphold the credibility of reporters and journalists the same way that people are working so hard to discredit them, we'd be in a better place.
I agree with you 1,000%. And, you straddle an interesting line between marketers and NGOs. And I think that it is not a knock on activists and NGOs, but so often the work that they do is grounded in a lot of research and wordiness, right? And the selling of the idea, I think that there's this attitude sometimes that like, well, the idea sells itself because it's so important. It's like, well, it's important to you and to your organization and the people that care about the thing that you care about.
Yeah.
But the trick is, how do you make other people who don't care about that thing care about that thing?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the kind of sweet spot in your world and in my world, right? Like we spend actually a lot of time on headlines. I have the first crack at writing my own headline. Mm-hmm. And I have a say in, if I don't like a headline that an editor has come up with. But we have Slack channels at the Washington Post in different departments. In the two departments I've worked in, we had these. I don't know about other departments where we workshop headlines. Mm-hmm. It's like, you give 2 or 3 sentences about what the story is. Hey, everybody, I need some help with a headline. And it's just an incredible process to watch. Like over the span of an hour, people, kind of share ideas back and forth, and the author says, well, I don't want that word in there because of X, and invariably you end up with the perfect headline, right?
Mhm.
Because it's like it's gone through this process of multiple
Yeah.
people doing it. And um I think we need more of that, right? Like less time focused on, okay, we need to present this policy document to the administration or to Congress or whatever to get them to do X, and more time like thinking about how are we going to get people to care about this?
Yeah.
Why does this matter to everybody?
That's great that you guys do that with headlines. Do you ever, does the same thing ever take place with issues that are persistent, or players that are persistent? And I bring this up because the other core element of branding, so we've got catchphrase, the other core element is repetition, right? So, there's a reason why Trump says the same thing 3 times in a sentence.
Right.
It's the start of repetition. And then the next time he's speaking, he says the same thing. And then the next 10 cronies all say the same thing, right? It's the repetition. And then after you've heard it 1,000 times, it becomes part of the vernacular. And I'm wondering, like, do you guys talk about labels? Like, are there things
I think
that go from story to story? Because that would be a really interesting element to bring into journalism.
I mean, I think our initial kind of gut response to that would be, we don't want to do that. And, oftentimes we change. And, I tell this story sometimes that, in 2012, when I was, still working in Tehran, I got a company-wide email from somebody in the HR department saying that we weren't supposed to use social media during working hours. And
2012, huh?
That was 2012, right? And I remember thinking to myself, okay, I understand why, as a correspondent out in the field, they want me to tweet out my stuff, and they want me to post it on Facebook, and they want me to, use social media. They must be talking about accounting and people who don't have a reason to use it all the time because it's a waste of their time or whatever. And you flash forward, now we have a guy whose sole job is to make a TikTok video every day, right? And I think that's awesome. But it just kind of goes to show how things change over time, how the mentality changes. For a long time, we couldn't judge. And I remember talking to you in the early 2000s about geo-targeting and all of this sort of stuff. I mean, it's gotten so much more precise now, right? We know how long anybody's on any given article. We know, where they came from, where they were 4 clicks before that, and where they went to after it. We know so much more about it. So, if an editor's attitude at a certain time was people aren't interested in stories about, food, right? Now we have data that says it doesn't matter what the editor says. The data tells us that people want to read about hamburgers in Vietnam, right? And so we kind of can follow those leads in a much more precise way than we ever could before. But in terms of repetition, I don't know. And I think that, again, like if you were to ask our average reader, they would probably say to you, that insults our intelligence and we don't want to, be repeated to. But as you and I both know, their subconscious mind wants exactly that. So, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's a little ahead of the times, maybe. I think I understand why journalism wouldn't want to, try to influence like that. But if you think about social media and the role that plays, it is really about influencing. And if you can influence around the truth with better branding and better taglines that exist from story to story, you create a narrative that repeats. You're less likely to have a story of 2 Reuters journalists being murdered and have that be a blip on the radar. Right. And go away. It becomes part of a larger narrative that I think sticks in people's minds more with better branding. So
Totally.
my goal is better branding for all issues that matter. And yeah, that's because that's what I work in.
Well, I think it's a lofty goal, and I think that news is moving in that direction. For a long time, for decades, right? We were ahead of the curve on a lot of things. I think for the last 15, 20 years, we might have been slightly behind it, but especially my company, I think we're catching up fast and pushing boundaries again. So I'm bullish on our future, but there's always work to be done and adjustments to be made around how you tell a story.
I love the work that the Post does. I subscribe to a handful of news outlets. It's important to pay for journalism. The Post is one of my favorite, and I encourage everybody else to subscribe. Read Jason's work, particularly the article coming out right around Press Freedom Day that talks about the infamous TV show. It's Grando, right? Is the name of the
Gando.
Gando.
Gando. Yeah, we don't need to get any more into that, but I will say that if I was worth 30 episodes worth of budget and multiple shooting locations in Iran, the podcast that I have coming out on Spotify this summer, which is 9 episodes, is definitely worth your time. So it's called 544 Days. It's a retelling of my story from the perspective of all the people who were involved in government and the Washington Post and my family in efforts to get me out. And as we say, it's a doozy.
When does it come out?
July.
Is there a link that people can go to now?
Not yet. So I'm breaking news right here that the deal is inked and this is coming soon.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. I'm excited to listen. We'll bookmark that for July and make sure to listen to that.
Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate all the time, Jason. I know you got a lot going on. But before you go, being, that Press Freedom Day is so near and dear to your heart and so many others, anyone that's listening and wants to do something about supporting a free press, do you have any recommendations of how they can be part of the solution?
Yeah, I want to repeat something that you just said. I mean, I pay for journalism. I always say, subscribe to one national paper and a local paper as well, if there is one. If there's not, find the closest, best thing in a community nearby because they need your support. And they are endangered species, to be perfectly honest. Vote in elections and more than anything, be mindful consumers of information. Try and look beyond the headlines. Try and read into the catchphrases. As we say, think for yourself, because there's plenty of people around who are going to offer to think for you, but there's no better replacement than your own mind when it comes to parsing out what you care about, what you believe in, and really what matters to your family and your future. I mean, when you pick up the Washington Post, not every article is intended for you, but much of it could be, and even those things that aren't can enrich your understanding of the world around you. So be savvy consumers of information and try and verify. What's the word I'm looking for? Gosh, this is baby dad brain. Diversify your sources of information. There was a time, when we were kids, that our parents understand much better than we do, but that most people would have subscription to 2 newspapers to understand what the other side thought, right? And, we are so adamant about hearing our own voices amplified these days.
Echo chamber. Yeah.
You don't want, you want to drown out what the other guy's saying because you don't want his side to win. That's not a good way. I mean, hear him out and, prove him wrong with facts.
I couldn't agree more. On election night, I tuned into Fox News. I was going back and forth. Yeah. Between CNN and Fox News and MSNBC all night. and I was pleasantly surprised, and yeah, I'm happy to have educated myself in that way. But just to see both sides, and you know, the side that maybe I'm guilty of villainizing as well, was telling a different perspective. And you know, not every guest on there maybe was someone that I agreed with, but many of the news anchors were very credible in the story that they were telling.
I think it is very important to hear what the other side is saying, or other sides are saying, and to be able to parse out what's true and what's not, right? And you
Yeah.
can't do that if you're just listening to your own single silo of information.
Awesome advice, Jason. Thanks again for all of it. Press freedom, more important than ever, in my opinion. I hope everyone takes a moment on May 5th to think about the service that journalists serve all of us with, and listen to Jason's advice to celebrate press freedom, not just on May 5th, but every day. So thank you again. Thank you for listening. Remember, change belongs to all of us. If not us, then who? If not now, then when, is the theme of the podcast. We all have the power to make a difference in the world. So similar to Jason, find your passion and follow it, and stand for what matters to you. If you want to suggest a host or an episode for us to do, go to ifnotus.tv and let us know. Thanks again. See you later.